It's Thursday and another edition of the Zogby Report, real and unscripted. As always, I'm here with my son Jeremy. How you doing?
Hey, Dad.
And we're going to talk politics today. Possibly two different topics, but all about ultimately the same thing: Trump versus Harris. So I'll start. And I read two distinctly different articles this week and ultimately put them together into what I think explains an enigma for me. And so I thought I wanted to share it with you and with our listeners, viewers. And so the first article was really counterintuitive because it said that of the 18% of the voters who remain undecided, more tended to be men than women. And that's really not only counterintuitive, that is contradictory. I have never been in a situation where the undecideds were fewer women than men. Generally, you can almost count on the undecideds being almost 2 out of 3 women. And so that kind of intrigued me. And it intrigued me as well because it said that of those undecided men, a considerable portion of them were under 35, 18 to 35 years of age. And I found that just very intriguing. Of course, so I read on. And, what it said was that men have traditionally understood their role in society. And that is to be the hunter-gatherer, the protector, the
breadwinner,
whatever. Yeah. And in today's world, young men, Z in particular, are finding themselves confused and in many instances even depressed. We know that young people just in general are considerably more anxiety ridden than older age cohorts. But this article zeroed in with interviews from people who answered a New York Times Siena poll and probed more deeply. And there was obviously the anxiety about the future, anxiety about my role in the world, but also my role in my family, my role with my girlfriend. How do I behave in the workplace? And they were leaning towards Trump. This kind of answered a question that we've had right along, because Trump, of course, is doing better among voters and doing better among younger voters than traditionally, a Republican would. But this is actually coming up with a reason for why not only young men are finding Trump appealing, but are in a really large gender gap between young women and young men. And it's over this confusion about what's my role as a male in modern society. And then as a final point, kind of adding icing to the cake, the conclusion was also that they like what they're hearing, even if they haven't made up their minds yet. They like what they're hearing from Donald Trump and from J.D. Vance, because the two are running a guy campaign. They're running a campaign that appeals to clarity, as Archie Bunker would say, when girls were girls and men were men, with an understanding that, hey, wokeism is not for us. There's a difference between men and women. Men have specific roles, and we need to go back to traditional roles, including locker room talk, macho talk, concern my truck, my car, my workout routine, my being a traditional man, because ultimately that's what women want. Now, wow, for somebody like me who tends to be very much on the liberal progressive side, that was hard to deal with. On the other hand, it explains a lot for me. And I know you have some stuff you want to talk about, but do you want to respond to that? Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, but I can't help but notice the urban elitist slant in all of that, because there is a lot of truth to that. But I think somewhere in that message, there's a tendency for people who think that to say, well, it's because sexism is coming back and because Trump unleashed something greater than, what we were prepared for. And there's automatically the assumption that we're going back to the medieval times and we're going to go back to cruder times. But what I'm seeing, remember, I'm a millennial. And of course, a lot of my friends most of my friends are my age. They're either in their early to mid 40s or their early to mid 30s, and some even in their late 20s. And look, we live in a swing district, right? I mean, our district can go either way. So we have a healthy slice of independent-minded people and conservative and liberal-minded people, especially the city of Utica, right? Very diverse. And what I'm seeing is more or less out of practicality that people are discovering that, yes, men and women have basic tendencies that are still ingrained in them from, hey, generations and generations, and that necessarily can't be educated away, right? Those impulses are still there. So put that aside, right? And so I wanted to respond to that. I think if men are liking that guy thing, I don't think that necessarily has to mean we're going back to chauvinistic times. Yes, that does exist, but I think there's also a practical-minded sense of, what you said, guys have a certain role and women have a certain role, and you divide it up, you divvy it up based on who's better at what. That's practical. But what I want to get into is, I'm hearing a lot of chatter, and you're still seeing this in polls, although it does seem a slew of polls have come out and are showing, I think, what you and I think is the reality of a tighter and a more competitive race. But still, here and there, you get these polls where, Harris is up by 5 or 6 or 7 points in a battleground state. Rather than getting into polls, because I've been doing that over and over and over, and you have too, I'm going to make it simple. I'm going to try and bring some clarity to this, improving why I don't, as alluring as the narrative is that Trump is falling apart, why I don't buy that. And I think it goes like this. You start with the basic premise that we are an incredibly divided nation. You start with the basic premise that neither candidate right now has that oomph to get that strong majority, right? It's going to take a lot to move the undecided voters, 5 or 7, percent or 10% of them to a lead, I should say, of one having a 5 or 7 point lead. A lot of that is driven by the fact that, each candidate does very well within their party. Kamala Harris, no doubt, is exciting Democrats, and Trump is no doubt about it, more or less exciting Republicans. But that the crossover appeal, it remains to be seen who can get the true swing vote and who can get the independents. And why is that? If I just say, well, we're a divided nation, I don't think I'm really getting at it. I think we have to look at it through this window. Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris is the epitome of our demographic divide, and that the United States, over the course of the past few presidential cycles, has become intensely divided demographically. You can't help but notice if you go on the news, the narrative of white versus non-white, black versus white, of man versus woman, as you kind of just laid out there, of young versus old, young voters, young people who came of age during the Great Recession, the bust, baby boomers and other similar cohorts who have known nothing but the boom. East Coast versus West Coast, liberal versus conservative, urban versus rural, these two embody that. And it's like, as these demographics have been pitted against each other greater and greater, it's like these two candidates have emerged on the scene, and they represent exactly that, that divide. And just by nature of that, you're going to have more or less an even race, and a race to who can move the needle. So I just wanted to lay that out.
Yep. Okay. So, in the final analysis, I think we're going to probably be spending our time looking at the selection with a great degree of granularity. The overall numbers are fascinating, but, in my book, I go beyond the overall numbers and get down into the things we need to be looking at. Young men, young women. Is the rhetoric used by Trump and by Vance in particular these days, is that going to alienate younger women and turn them out to vote in greater numbers? Those are the countervailing numbers that we're going to have to look at. We're also going to have to look at who is a Republican. We did a fascinating project for the Committee for Democracy, and what we discovered was a decent number of Republicans calling for federal intervention to make sure that our rivers and streams are cleaned up, that they wanted Congress to ensure the cleanliness of those rivers and streams, not leave it up to the states. And I found that fascinating until we drilled down to discover that there was a preponderance among Republicans of anglers and hikers and hunters and boaters who love the outdoors. And so, who are we? Am I a Republican, or am I someone who loves the outdoors? Rather than pigeonholing people on the basis of one demographic or one ideology, we're deeper than that. And those are the points that I think we ought to spend our time going over. But we talked about the guy thing and wonder where that's going to take us. And then you raised your points as well. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think this ties very neatly into everything that we've just laid out about demographic division and some of these unique aspects that are overlooked of when we think of environment and environmentalists, we tend to think of liberal and left, but there are conservationists, right?
Sure.
Who, as you just, laid out, tend to be conservative, and the dynamics of who's going to drive, which one is going to drive enough young women and young men and women and men in general, as well as the truly independent vote, the swing vote, those who have gone both ways over their voting history. And really, what you have to bring up, I'm reminded of this, is the Kennedy voters, right? Mm-hmm. RFK, no doubt about it, the most successful third-party candidate, a third-party candidacy since Ross Perot, was polling at above Ross Perot numbers, what Perot finished with. And even still, before he dropped out in some polls, still was in double digits. And so, I mean, on the low end, I don't take seriously the ones that were saying 2, 3, but on the low end, you could say 5, on the high end, 11 or 12. Regardless, that's the difference between the election. And so, because he brings this dynamic of because he was very popular among the independent voters, and in many polls was leading among them, the independent voters, and even after Biden dropped out, was still very competitive among the independent voters. That's key. But then, you have all kinds of other things, his other issues with advocacy. And what does he do for young women, and what does he do for young men? On the one hand, he's hard hitting, right? When he speaks about an issue, he's very cutting. You know, he's very direct, but at the same time, he does it with a very moderate temperament that Trump doesn't have. And so one has to ask the question, did the Democrats make a big mistake by not courting him? Did they make a big mistake by pushing him out away from their circle, and then first towards the independent run and then ultimately into the hands of the Republicans? But that's a dynamic that I would watch for, is that voter who over the course of many months wanted to support Kennedy, which way they will break, because I think that could ultimately be the deciding factor, right? Just by virtue of him having been in double digits.
I was just looking at the battleground state polling. It is so razor thin. You know, Harris is pulled into the lead, but 0.1%, 1% in some states. And the two where Donald Trump leads, he leads by 1.0%. And so, yeah, anything that can move even a few hundred voters could be significant. Okay, I will, as I will continue to do, remind people that my book about how to read polls, Beyond the Horse Race, How to Read Polls and Why We Should, is available and for sale wherever you buy your books. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Goodreads, and the publisher, Roman Littlefield. That's all I have. How about you?
I think we laid out a bit. And so we'll just do this again in another week, and I'm sure there will be big news between now and then.
And meanwhile, we'd love to hear from you. So, please write in. Okay, have a good week. Take care.
Yep, take care.